Welcome to this Introduction to Foundation Paper Piecing mini workshop. My name is HollyAnne, Knight of String and Story, and it's my job to guide you to quilt with confidence. Today I'm going to show you guys how to make this diamond into square block. It's very similar to an economy block. I think it has one more extra round that goes around it. It's perfect for using up little bits, for fussy cutting, and for practicing your foundation paper piecing skills for the very first time. So this is the block that we're going to be making. You can see over here I have already lined up some fabrics, starting with the little teacup we're going to put in the center of our block all the way through the outer edge. So I've chosen my fabrics ahead of time to streamline this process a little bit. Now, if you want to stitch along with me, you can find this template in a set of 2 over on my website. I've got the link down in the caption of this video for you so that you can stitch right along and grow in your confidence of foundation paper piecing as I am teaching today. Now, in addition to your foundation paper and some fabric, now you know this is a 4.5 inch block. It's not going to take a lot of fabric. So use some scraps, make sure you have your foundation paper. You're also going to want to make sure that you have your snoring dog sitting nearby, because who doesn't love a good office pup? Are you okay down there, honey? Very good. She's expressing the general angst of foundation paper piecing, but here's the thing, I'm here to take the angst out of it for you. All right, this may be the Ginger Rogers of quilting. It may feel like we're doing everything backwards and in high heels, but I'm gonna take you through step by step today. So in addition to your fabric and your foundations, you're gonna want a cutting mat handy, a rotary cutter, and I highly recommend an add a quarter ruler. This is a really simple notion. It makes it a lot easier to do the trimming up. Now, we're just making one block today, so I do not have my light box handy, but you can see that this is a translucent cutting mat. If I'm making a whole bunch of these blocks, I have a daylight, this is the daylight cutting mat. I have a daylight wafer light box that I keep handy as well. But right now, right overhead, I have a couple of daylight lamps. So I'm gonna be using those to see through my paper today, okay? All right, let's get started. First up, I'm gonna grab a straight pin and my fabric. I want you to remember that you're always going to be stitching here on the printed side. Your fabric's going to go on the back, and we're literally going to count to 12 together, okay? Let's get started by centering my little teacup on the back. I'm going to hold this up to the light and get it right where I want it. Y'all might just barely be able to see through that paper there. And holding it in place with one hand, I'm going to take a straight pin and poke right through, okay? Next up, I have my green fabric that we're gonna use in order to do these first round of triangles, okay? My favorite way to cut these, honestly, is to cut some rectangles, because then you don't have to worry about whether the triangle-y shape that you've made lines up. As you grow in your skill, you'll be able to estimate a big old square and then cut it on the diagonal and line it up. But that gets a little bit more advanced. So let's start real basic today and just cut some rectangles. I can kind of hold my template over my fabric here to get an idea of how wide I want to cut this. Now, oh, it did cut through. There's the bump. I wasn't sure if it would cut smoothly. And I'm going to line up, remember when we're stitching our fabrics, we put them right sides together. And again, I'm going to hold this up to the light. And my fabric comes to about here. And my line is here. I'm going to be stitching on this line so that once this is stitched, I can flip it out and have a seam allowance, okay? So hold up to the light one more time. Double, triple check yourself. And then we're going to go right underneath our presser foot here and stitch directly on this line. And I should have made sure my thread snips are handy. I have a thread cutter on this machine, but it's not always reliable about pulling my thread up when I'm stitching short seams like this, so we're just going to be trimming along together. Now, this is the part where things get interesting, right? Our next step is to flip this over and hold in place our fabric we just sewed, and then hold it up to the light. We want to make sure it covers this whole triangle plus approximately a quarter seam. If it doesn't do that, then we'll need to unpick this and try again, but mine does. So from the paper side, I'm going to fold along the seam. Notice I've put my fabrics back right side together. That's super important. So my fabrics are right sides together. I'm going to line up my add a quarter ruler and trim off the excess right underneath you guys there. All right. And then we begin to see how this is going to fill in. So finger press it up. And this time we leave that piece of fabric open. Now from this side, if we can get a little bit of light through here, you might just barely be able to see. We've got 1 and 2. Next up, we're gonna do 3. Same thing. I'm gonna cut a strip of fabric. Ooh, trying not to bump you guys unsuccessfully. And repeat the steps that I just did for step 2, okay? Here, we want to make sure we have overlap of this new piece and this old piece. So as we press these out, these seams are going to be neatly overlapping to hold in place. Now, if it makes you nervous, you can drop a pin in this. Otherwise, just hold everything secure with your fingers. And again, to sew piece 3, we're going to sew right on this line. Trim all my threads. All right, flip it over, finger press, and check to the light. Absolutely beautiful. Put those right sides back together to fold the paper. I'm actually gonna go ahead and pull this pin out because the head's about to be in the way. And trim. Now notice, the way that I'm demonstrating this for you guys today, right? I'm working with big old scraps, and I'm trimming off big bits, all right? You don't have to trim off bits this big. You can be much more economical in how you're trimming your fabric. But it makes it a little bit easier to demonstrate this. Now, this piece that I just trimmed off, I think is big enough to go on this side. So I'm gonna hold it up to the light and find out for sure. Oh yes, that's gonna do like literally perfectly. So see, I cut a big piece, but already I'm reusing that to put it back under the machine. I'm gonna drop this needle down and just double check everything's in place. So right along the line. Trim all my threads. If you and your thread cutter get along on your machine, this is an excellent time to use it, okay? Once again, flip open, double check, flip back, fold the paper, and then trim. And notice how the little lip of this outer quarter ruler just so nicely sits. I'm gonna hold my rotary cutter funny so that my hand is not quite as in y'all's face. This edge just slips right up against that paper and adds a nice neat 1/4 inch seam. Otherwise this would get really, really bulky. And see how all these are overlapping? We want it to be like that. So when this next piece comes across, there's still a 1/4 inch seam here. Now, once again, I cut this bit off. Let's see if it's the right size to fill in this space. Perfect. Slide it under my machine. And trim. What I like about using this particular block to teach foundation paper piecing is that I think one of the trickier bits of foundation paper piecing is triangles and thinking through that shape. And by simply starting you off there with a block that is pretty forgiving, and you know, it's easy to have good margins on this block and all of that, take some of that fear out. Because a lot of what happens with foundation paper piecing is using triangles to make funky shapes. Now you can see I've got my little teacup with my little rose, and you can see already how this is going to take shape, because as we then add these next sections on, right, you can see how we're going to end up with our little triangles. So let's keep going. always rather trim a little big. You've got a stitch or two that kind of overlaps there. Just pop it. And trim. Now, one of the questions that I get asked is about stitch length. Now, you may be able to see here, I keep the stitch length on my machine pretty short to start with. So I do not shorten my stitch length even further when I'm doing this, because what I find is that it perforates the paper too much then. And it becomes too easy for these papers to start falling apart before I even get the whole thing together. So it takes a little bit more work, perhaps, to remove the papers at the end. But I don't like it when my bits start to go before I'm done sewing. This final piecing seam, notice I've been finger pressing all the way along this, right? So this would be a great time to hit this with an iron. I do not have my iron right here, but I do have my seam roller. So I'm just gonna crisp up these seams a little bit with a little extra pressure so that we can go ahead and trim this block. Because your final stage will be to recognize that this is going to be where the block finishes. This is your seam allowance. So we trim to the dotted line, and I'm gonna trim right down here so that I'm on a smooth surface, since this is the final edge of the block. All the way around. And voila! You have foundation paper pieced your very first diamond in a square block. Congratulations, Rockstar!